Chapter 7. After a long moment of sober consideration, Dusty struck a match and bent down to examine the body of Ben Thurston. Most of the Colorado's lad's face had been shot away by two well-aimed bullets, leaving only a smashed and bloody pulp above the collar of his striped shirt. A small square of white cardboard showed beneath the fingers of Ben's right hand. Dusty stopped to pick it up. It was the picture of Katie Rollins which Ben had showed him so proudly only a short time before. The match burned down in Dusty's fingers while he stared down at that picture. In the resulting darkness he still saw it plainly. The hopeful eyes and the hint of a smile curving her wide lips. It was almost morning, and she'd be waiting for Ben Thurston in Hermosa. A Ben Thurston whom she had never seen, but whom she trusted for help in whatever danger threatened her. As he thought about it, Dusty decided it was lucky that this had happened to Ben Thurston before he reached Hermosa. Lucky for Ben and from Katie Rollins. Ben had died thinking of himself as sort of a hero. He wouldn't have to see the disappointment that he would have brought Katie when she saw the useless youth who had answered her call for help. And it would be easier on Katie, too. She wouldn't have any false hopes to get rid of later. Then he shook his head angrily and turned his thoughts to his own predicament. He had to get out of this death trap fast. He knew he must be at least 15 or 20 miles from the border. If the posse knew he was a passenger on the coach, his position was extremely precarious. A daring idea came to him as he swiftly considered all possibilities. Why not give the posse a victim? Here at his feet was one made to the order. He wasn't well known in Marfa. He and Ben Thurston were near enough of about the same size for the dead body to be accepted as his if it was found wearing his clothes. And he could go on down to Hermosa as Ben Thurston. No one in Hermosa had ever seen Ben. He made his decision quickly and knelt beside the corpse. He stripped the boy's pants off and replaced them with his own blue jeans, and then twisted the lifeless body to pull off the coat and striped shirt. It was a job getting his faded shirt and leather jacket back into the lifeless body, but he accomplished the task finally and steeled himself to get into the dead youth's clothing. The pants were a trifle long and tight in the hips. The coat bound his shoulders and the cuffs came high upon his wrists, but he reckoned they'd do until he could replace them with some new-bought clothing. Ben had a 6-gun buckled around his waist, his daddy's old gun, Dusty supposed, and he left it there. He wore his own hat and kept the picture of Katie Rollins in a leather wallet which he found in Ben's coat pocket. He left some papers of his own in his clothing on Ben and a small part of his money just to make it look all regular to the posse. It was breaking dawn in the east when he drew in a deep breath and climbed out of the overturned stage. He felt funny, constricted in the new clothes, but a driving compulsion to be away from the scene dispatched any feelings of squeamishness about the transaction. He hesitated outside the stage, listening intently down the road, but could hear nothing as yet to show that pursuers were near. Some of the horses were still snorting and kicking feebly in their tangled harnesses. Dusty went around to them, and found that both wheelers and one of the lead team was dead. The leader was shot, and the other two had suffered broken necks in the tumble down the hillside. One of the middle team had a broken leg. Dusty killed him with a bullet through his head. His mate and the other leader struggled frantically to escape, and Dusty quieted them with soothing words while he untangled the harness and got them free. He turned the leader loose, but kept the bridle on the other unharmed horse, a raggy sorrel who had some old saddle marks on his back. He cut the leather lines off short to serve as reins, and then lightly vaulted onto the sorrel's bare back. He snorted and made a half-hearted effort to blow up, but he was broken to ride, and he lunged away at a lope when Dusty rowelled him and headed him down the canyon in the same direction taken by the two hold-up men. A quarter of a mile away, the deep ravine widened out into a greasewood flat and crossed the stage road which angled around from the top of the steep cliffs over which the coach had fallen. The hoof prints of the killer's horses turned out to the canyon alongside the road. Dusty Morgan did likewise, keeping the sorrel at a steady gallop, and that ate up for miles. The sun rose behind him, showing a desolate country here as the road neared the border. The stagecoach had crossed a low range of mountains southwest of Marfa, from which the territory sloped downward through the foothills and badlands into the sweeping valley of the Rio Grande. Beyond the river, the slope rose sharply to the foot of the towering, snow-capped Mexican peaks. On the American side, the ground was badly cut by small gullies and dry washes, and vegetation consisted of stunted mesquite and greasewood. There was little grass for stock, and Dusty saw a few grazing cows as he rode along. He wondered about that. He'd always heard of the Big Bend as fine cow country, and had envisioned it as rich with grass and running streams. But this part of it was as bad as the alkali flats up in the Pecos where he had been reared, that wouldn't support more than a dozen jackrabbits to the acre, or 2 or 3 head of stock to every section, maybe. He began to wonder if the huge, prosperous Katy Ranch was only a myth, or if he had somehow got turned off in the wrong direction during the night. But the stage driver had said he was heading for Hermosa, and that had been where Ben Thurston's destination was as well. The country did get a little better, he noticed, as he rode along, heading towards the river. Not a whole lot better, but there were some good patches of bunch grass and some lacy mesquite bush that had pushed out a new crop of beans. There were more cattle, too, but none that he saw that they carried the KT brand. Most of them had an XL on their sides, white faces who lifted their heads and stared after him mournfully as he rode by on the road bareback. He was plenty cautious of the harness bridle and the lack of saddle as the sun grew higher behind him, and he knew he must be getting nearer to Hermosa. It wasn't part of his plan to tell anyone that he'd come from the wreck stage, and he knew he had to get rid of the sorrel with the telltale binders on his bridle before he met anyone. But he wanted to ride in as close as possible, not being too partial to foot walking in his high-heeled boots. So he kept on down the dusty road at a lope, watching ahead and behind him for sight of another rider before he was seen. He was almost on the village of Hermosa before he realized it. 3 miles back, the road had turned sharply to the right and followed the slope downward towards what he guessed would be the Rio Grande, though he hadn't seen any sign of a river ahead. Abruptly, the road reached the edge of a sheer limestone cliff which angled sharply downward, and there was the river, and a town right below him. A bunch of sun-baked adobe houses squatted on a narrow strip of flat land between the base of the cliff and the river. There were giant cottonwoods along the edge of the water that were interspersed with clumps of cedar. He pulled up sharply and slid off the sorrel's back. These must be the rim rocks he had heard about. Further south, they narrowed into a deep gorge cut by the river, but all along here there was a very expanse between the base of the rim rocks and the placid river. Dusty led the sorrel back along the road where he couldn't be seen from below, and slid the bridle off his head. He spoke to the horse. "Go on, boy," and he gave him a light whack with the reins. The horse snorted and trotted down towards the road, heading over the rim rocks and down towards the village. If the people in Hermosa didn't already know what the hold-up and about the stage wreck, Dusty knew that they'd do some speculating when that horse came a-trotting in, unharnessed and alone. Even if he wasn't recognized as one of the 6-horse team, the collar and harness marks were plain on him, and they'd know he was running away from something. Instead of following the horse down, Dusty turned off the road and went back on foot along the jagged rim, keeping out of sight of town until a bulge gave him a chance to go down undetected. It was a pretty steep going down, and he let himself down cautiously from hand hold to foot grip, and then lost control and slid the last 50 feet down. He got up and dusted himself off, then sauntered down the Rimrock Road, following close alongside the bank of the river, and plodded along down it towards the road. There were 3 buildings on the Hermosa main street. The nearest one, as Dusty approached, was the saloon. 4 saddle horses stood at the hitching rack outside, and 4 men stood in a small group and curiously watched him approach, head down, limping a little. Observing their curious glances from under the brim of his black Stetson hat, Dusty couldn't repress a rueful little grin. He couldn't blame them for being curious. He knew he must look pretty funny. Any man on foot is a marked man in cow country, and his city suit and striped shirt must look mighty funny in Hermosa. He took a deep breath and tilted his hat up as he approached the 4 men in front of the saloon. They all wore dusty range clothes and all carried guns. There wasn't anything remarkable about the 3 of them. The 4th was a head taller than the others, a rangy man with a big nose flattened down above a wide mouth. He wore a buckskin jacket that was decorated with fancy Mexican silver trinkets, and his holster was on his left hip opposed to his right. He carried an ivory-handled .45 with the butt turned forward in a position for a right-hand draw across the body. It was the first time Dusty had ever seen a gun carried in that manner, but he'd heard about men who claimed it was the fastest. He was always hankering to find out. Now, looking at that tall, hawk-faced stranger, he had a feeling he'd have a chance to find out before very long. He just didn't naturally cotton to that man's looks. But he stopped in front of the group and grinned at them all and asked, "Whereabouts can a man buy a horse?" The tall man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dusty street and asked, "Walked far, stranger?" "Not too far. My horse got snake bit down the road." "Where you riding from?" "Is that any of your damn business?" Dusty asked softly. The other 3 punchers stiffened and quietly stepped aside, leaving Dusty and the 4th man facing each other. A queer light flickered in the tall man's eyes. His expression did not change. He studied Dusty's city suit and the striped shirt, slid his gaze down to the slanting gun belt and holster that showed beneath the bottom of his coat. He spat into the street again, rumbled, "Kinda ringy, ain't ya?" "Sorta," Dusty agreed bleakly. There was a chill in the air, as though a heavy cloud had blanketed out the sun, and through the morning sky was cloudless, though. Glasses clinked inside the saloon, and there was no other sound on the main street of Hermosa. "No need to get yourself bowed up like a rodeo bronc," the rangy man said. "I reckon there ain't," Dusty agreed. The big man got out the makings from his pocket and tore a brown paper from a book. He handed the small packet to Dusty. The morning air was warm again. He sifted the tobacco into the creased paper and offered the open sack to Dusty. "No need to buy yourself a horse, neither," he went on casually. "I'm Lon Boxley, riding for the XL. I can put a man like you on the payroll." "No matter where I'm riding from?" Dusty caught one of the yellow strings of the tobacco sack and pulled it shut, eyeing Boxley gravely. "Don't matter much from where a man's riding from. It's where he's heading." "What makes you think I want a job?" Boxley shrugged and lit his cigarette. "Save you buying a horse." A rider was galloping headlong along the road from the top of the rim rock. He pulled up in front of the saloon in a cloud of dust and shouted, "There's hell to pay to back down the road. The stagecoach turned over the hill. Driver's dead and a passenger and 4 of the horses." "Any other passengers?" Boxley demanded. "Nary one." The rider shook his head and mopped his face. "They was both shot. 2 of the horses, too." "Hold up," Boxley exclaimed. "Looks like it all right." "The stage agent was right," Boxley said, "about that sorrel that come trotting in a while ago." He turned to Dusty swiftly. "You don't know nothing about it, do you?" Dusty shook his head. "I come up the Rimrock Road." There was another interruption. A pair of splendidly matched horses came galloping along a bend on the other end of the block. They were harnessed to a buckboard driven by a woman who was standing up behind the dashboard sawing on the lines. She was hatless, and her brown hair was flying in the wind. The team slowed to a trot, tossing their heads impatiently, and to a walk as they came opposite of the saloon. Dusty let smoke dribble from each nostril and lounged against a post looking at the girl. Katie Rollins was prettier than the picture of her in his pocket. Lots prettier. She was the prettiest thing Dusty had ever laid eyes upon. Her body was slender, but girlishly round in jeans and a woolen shirt. Her eyes glowed with the same wistful look the picture had shown, and her lips were upcurved even as she asked anxiously, "Is the stage in yet, Lon? The one from Marfa?" Lon Boxley swept off his hat and stepped down in the dust to lean over the front wheel of her buckboard. Dusty narrowed his eyes and watched the glow go away from her eyes. She tightened her lips and sat down suddenly, as though a blow to the solar plex had left her limp. Her softly tanned cheeks whitened a little, and she put up one hand as though to ward off Lon Boxley's words. Boxley leaned closer, speaking in a low, persuasive tone. Katie Rollins began to shake her head, seeming to brace her lithe young body in the high seat. "I'm not whipped yet, Lon." Her throaty voice carried easily to Dusty lounging on the boardwalk. "I'll find some rider somewhere." Dusty spun his cigarette away and stepped into the street. He stopped behind Boxley and spoke over his head to the girl. "Begging your pardon, ma'am. I heard you say you were looking for some riders. I'm sort of foot loose." Boxley turned on him with a snarl. "You're already hired. Get back up there and shut up." Dusty was looking right into Katie Rollins' face, into the surge of hope that lit her eyes when he first spoke. He watched the light fade away to hopelessness as she took in his city rigging and as she heard Boxley's statement. "You can have him, Lon," she said helplessly. "The KT needs a man." Dusty dropped his gaze to Boxley's face. "I ain't signed on to take orders from you." "You heard her say she needs a man. Know where she can find one?" Boxley sneered. Dusty grinned at him. A terrifying, lopsided grin. He shrugged his shoulders to loosen the tight coat, let it slide off, and drop to the ground. "Maybe I can prove it to her." And then he drove his right fist into Boxley's face. The tall rancher staggered back under the impact. Dusty turned away from him and asked Katie, "Still wondering where you can find a hand?" Her eyes dilated and she cried, "Watch out!" pointing behind him. Dusty whirled, his hand streaking to his gun. A bullet tugged at his shirt sleeve as he whirled. Lon Boxley lay in the dust with a drawn gun. Dusty's muzzle covered the fallen man, and his finger was tight upon the trigger when Katy cried out, "No, no," and kept him from firing. He stepped forward instead and kicked the gun out of Boxley's hand. Then he turned and faced the three punchers who were edging forward towards the fracas. He holstered his gun again and asked harshly, "Which one of you wants some of this trouble?" They stopped and began to back away. Without turning, he ordered Katy gruffly, "Drive up here close." She let the team come forward and said in a strained voice, "You shouldn't." Dusty turned and vaulted into the front seat of the buckboard. He snatched the lines from the astonished girl's hands and whooped up the horses. They swerved in a short arc and broke into a gallop as Dusty sent a couple bullets over the head of the three men in the street behind him. He holstered his gun and laughed down into Katy Rollins' face as her fist pounded upon his muscular forearm. "You said the KT needed a man," he reminded her. "All right, you got one. Which way's home?" End of chapter 7.